Yeah, I think it's always quite a little bit disingenuous to say that XR or any kind of technology is going to completely eradicate physical modeling and prototyping. Like,
Yeah.
there's so much learning you can get from that, and we're always cautious about making statements like that. But there's a great example I heard from the marine industry where if they want to explore a physical space, a space that they're going to build within like a boat, for instance, they will often build a full mock-up out of MDF or plywood. And these things are huge and take up a lot of space, take a lot of time. As we talked about previously, the design will have kept marching on since then, so they'll be out of date anyway. And normally they're building them to do things like check access panels for maintenance, for instance. Now that is a phenomenal use case for XR because what they're really having to do is bring a trained maintenance person into the building, into this mock-up to test whether they can get their tools or they can reach the things that they need to reach within the behind the access panel. That's a phenomenal use case for XR because you can use the digital twin. You can do those things in XR in virtual reality. You know, you can the maintenance engineer doesn't have to know how to use the CAD system. You put the headset on, they can walk around an environment they're familiar with, they can test access, and you can learn all of that in hours rather than weeks that it would take to build that prototype and get that person on site.
Away from home, other connection feels so strange. People changing with every phase, holding tight through space and time. Across dimensions, hearts align.
I met a Rick!
What? Let's dive in.
Welcome back to another episode of Meta Rick. Here's where we talk with builders, with business leaders and program leaders from large enterprise companies to talk about emerging technologies like XR and artificial intelligence. Many times on the show, you've seen me bring folks on who I have been very excited to follow their content and kind of see their stories on LinkedIn. And this is another one of those examples where I've been seeing Ben Widdowson from Siemens kind of share progress on the technologies that they're building. And it's been interesting to kind of see little bits and pieces of his story on social media. And today we get to share that story with all of you. So Ben, for the listener who's making a decision right now on whether they're going to sit with us for the next hour or so, how would you describe, how do you think your friends or your colleagues might describe you in like 2 or 3 sentences?
So I guess my colleagues probably know more about what I do from a content perspective relevant to this podcast. So they would probably say I'm one of the leaders in terms of XR within Siemens, and we're really pushing that story around how designers and engineers can start to use XR beyond just gaming and content consumption, but for actually creating content and building the products that we use every day.
Beautiful. And before we get into the Siemens story, because I think that's going to be a good bulk of our conversation, is the really great technology you guys are building. I want to get into a little bit more about Ben. So you've been around design engineering and visualization very early in your career. And then it seems like you took a pivot into the sales side of things and founding your own consultancy before eventually joining the team at Siemens. Talk me through that story. Like, how did you start your career and kind of what led you to eventually getting into the role that you're in today?
Yeah, sure. So I've always been I would class myself as a maker or a creative business person, creative first intentionally. So I've always built things. As a kid, I'd build tree houses and skate ramps in my summer holidays. Was forever cutting up bits of wood on the driveway at home to make the latest creation. Um, so when I finished high school, I went to university to study product design or design engineering. So I did that for 3 years in the University of Liverpool in the UK. And it was around that time actually that the first Iron Man film came out. And I always remember a scene from that film where Tony Stark's back at home base in his kind of man cave, and he's developing that, I guess it's the Mark II, but that kind of first proper Iron Man suit. And he's talking to Jarvis using AI and natural language. He's looking at the design in augmented reality. And that always struck me as a recent grad as a designer. Like, this is just one of the coolest things I've ever seen. And I always remember thinking to myself, like, when will we be able to do this for real as a designer? Surely it's going to be soon. And this was 2007, so we're nearly 20 years on, and we still kind of ask that question. When will we be able to design like this? And we'll maybe come on to that in a bit. But after university, I practiced as a designer, making furniture, designing furniture for kind of mass scale, flat pack type stuff. And then I went into business with my best friend, a guy called James Clark, and we did a kind of product design consultancy for a couple of years. And that was right around the time of the global economic crisis. So we were not really making any money. We employed a few people. We had some fun. We had did some cool projects, but it never really kind of took off. So then I moved into a sales role within a SaaS company. And that was what I was doing for a couple of years before joining a company in the UK called Lightworks, or Lightwork Design. And they specialized in high-end rendering and XR at the time, or kind of they were one of the first companies to get into developing XR applications. And they eventually got bought by Siemens in 2008. So I joined Siemens in 2008, and then I am now part of the product marketing team for NX, which is our 3D CAD tool. And for the last few years, I've been leading the marketing collaboration with Sony.
So it seems like I'd almost break that down into three main eras of your professional career. There's like the founder era of going off on your own and kind of managing your own business, and then there's the sales era, and then now the kind of marketing era. During the founder era, what was that process like to go from zero to something? Like how did you get your first couple of customers?
Yeah, interestingly, we had a really strong network of startup businesses at the time in Manchester, in the UK. There was a real kind of moment there for a few years where lots of companies were starting out. There was some big companies that have gone on to be very successful, and in fact, two or three of the businesses that I met at the time, or the founders, we're still very close friends with, and we socialize every year. And they're still one of them's in fact still doing the same business. Um, in terms of winning business, it was a real mixture of kind of scrappy sales, reaching out to companies, networking. We did end up getting a couple of referrals actually, and we did some pretty high profile projects, at least for a kind of bunch of graduates who didn't really know what they were doing. But I would say that the kind of biggest lessons from that period really are um, learning how to sell, learning how to run a business, and learning how to manage people, or at least my first experiences of that. I think all of the technical components of whatever it is you're doing, the design piece or anything else you're doing in business, is all learnable, or at least that's the kind of entry into the space. But I think learning how to manage people, manage a business, and win business are three of the biggest challenges that everyone faces.
Yeah, totally. And I think that there's a lot of overlap between sales roles and founder personalities, right? It's like if you strip away a lot of the stresses of operating a business, right? Like not having to manage the admin and necessarily managing the entire team and kind of the facilitation and delivery, and you get to just focus on the go-to-market and the client relationship side of things. I think a lot of salespeople tend to be very entrepreneurial. Like it tends to kind of pull in that mindset of owning that book of business and kind of taking a lot of ownership over your revenue number and your kind of piece of the company.
Absolutely. It's the
Um,
hardest thing to do is win new business. And it's the bit that if you ask any business owner, they want more customers, they want more revenue. And actually to go out and make that happen is it's a real skill and an art form. And I think people still associate it with a kind of, a black art or a slightly, dirty role, but I'm still very impressed. And I actually observe salespeople when I interact with them now, and just observe the subtle kind of cues they're going through, the little beats they go through in their process, and I still find it fascinating.
yeah, it is really interesting. I'm curious if this impacted you the same it did with me. I felt like maybe year 2 or 3 as a salesperson, like you're so focused on these social skills of like being able to understand like how someone's feeling and be able to match their energy and be able to kind of meet them where they are in a conversation. I felt like all of the things I was learning in sales impacted my social life a whole lot. Like it made me more empathetic, it made me a better friend. Like there was a lot of things where I think sales can get a bad rep sometimes about like manipulation or persuasion, and people
Yeah,
think of
yeah,
like the whole Wolf of Wall Street thing. But
yeah, yeah.
I actually found myself becoming a lot more intentional with my conversations socially. Like I felt like I was actually deepening my relationships with people, even outside of work. Did you feel kind of a similar thing to that?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I also find, I mean, I'm a natural introvert. I was always the shy kid at school. I hated, public speaking or end of year school performances, anything on stage or singing. That always terrified me. It still does to some degree, but I think sales really taught me how to be myself and, be kind of authentic and honest. And people just inherently learn how to latch onto that. I think they can read you if you're bullshitting them or if you're being inauthentic or you're trying to sell them something, as salespeople often are. But I think if you're authentic and you build a relationship, people are much more open and willing to trust, I think.
Yeah, I think so much about successful sales careers is picking good products. Like if like my nothing against the first company I worked for. I actually think for that industry, they do a pretty good job of caring and customer success. It's like a very kind of like the privately owned company. The founders built it from the ground up, so there was like a good soul to the company. But it was the credit card processing industry, and so unless you're on that founding team that like built it because you're really a part of it, it's hard for people to be super passionate about
Yeah,
credit card machines, you know.
yeah,
But I found once I got out of that world and started focusing on selling like creative content and storytelling or getting into XR technologies and things I really do care about, it totally changes the type of relationship building and type of sales process, because like you genuinely give a damn about what you're doing, and that comes across when you talk about it with people.
yeah, yeah, for sure.
Now that sales career side before you got it into Siemens, you did that for a while, right? So you were a strategic account manager at Sabisu for 3 years, and then the pre-sales consultant moved into a director role. Talk me through a little bit of that life cycle. So it seems like light work design was kind of the big piece of it pre-acquisition. What was that story arc for you from pre-sales consultant to moving into more of a director leadership role?
Um, so the company itself was about 30 people when I joined. Um, and their kind of core skill was very technical. They would sell effectively kind of rendering and visualization toolkits to CAD companies, and Siemens was one of those. So they were selling technical stuff to technical companies. So there was a relatively small number of companies in the world who would be interested in that. So it was always a very engaged sales process. We talked about LinkedIn before. LinkedIn was incredibly powerful for identifying those companies and identifying the individuals within those companies to build relationships with. I was very lucky in the sense that the people already within the business had great relationships with most of the companies that you would want to engage with. But it was at a time when game engines were becoming more prevalent. Unity was really starting to get a foothold in the market. Epic Games was starting to get a big foothold in the market. And there were lots of emerging applications that were starting to be built on game engines and using real-time technology, as opposed to the kind of traditional, ray tracing technology where you press a button and wait for 10 minutes and you get a nice pretty picture at the end. People were moving more into real time. So that opened up a whole new range of emerging companies to go and engage with. And that's, from a sales perspective, that's how it kind of merged the company's focus as much as anything in becoming not just a kind of rendering ray tracing focused company, but a kind of real time focused company. And with that came the advent of some of the earlier, current wave of devices like the Vive and the Oculus Rift. And that's how we kind of really got to start learning about XR and some of the enterprise use cases and challenges that came with that.
At that company, like were you mostly focused on in headset experience, or what was the split on kind of in headset versus 3D design, like on a desktop?
Yeah, so when I joined, it was 100% 3D design, and I would say now, if you look at that team who got acquired by Siemens, they are effectively the same core group of people with new people who've joined, and are now, I would say, almost exclusively real time, doing stuff in Unreal Engine for XR. So it's been a 10-year journey to get to that point, but they've probably been working in XR now for, I'd say, that core group of people, maybe 7 or 8 years now. I think what was interesting at the time was, one of the biggest challenges and I think barriers to adoption for XR in the design engineering world. I'm not talking about gaming or content consumption, which are kind of the predominant use cases, but for companies wanting to use it in the design space, your biggest challenge really is that the data you're creating is changing every minute. You've got hundreds of designers working on the next car, plane, boat, building, and they're working on thousands of parts, and all of those parts are managed very carefully in a system that means they're secure, and manages all the change. But with that change, if you wanted to get into XR 7 or 8 years ago, that meant you'd have to export a whole ton of data, load it into Unity or Unreal, probably build some kind of experience around it. You had to learn how to build navigation and selection and all that kind of stuff, some of which came for free. But that whole round trip just made it prohibitive for a designer because your parts have changed 3 or 4 times by the time you've done that export. So if you want to do any work in there, it's impossible, and you can't push that data back into the CAD system. So it tended to get used for like an exact presentation or a marketing demo, or a kind of flashy, here's the final product and what it's going to look like, and we can kind of say we're experiencing it before we manufacture it, those kinds of things. But it was never really being used by real engineers on a day-to-day basis because of that data round trip problem. And that was a problem space that we really dove deep into 6 or 7 years ago with Lightworks. At the time, we had a product called Slipstream, which was designed initially to be a kind of CAD to VR pipeline tool. And we had some fantastic discussions at the time with some great companies, worked really closely with the enterprise team at Epic Games um, to try and solve this problem and effectively try and automate it, but it was still a kind of automated export into an Unreal app. So you were still taking the data out and doing something with it, albeit and pushing it into a kind of VR experience. And that kind of solved the problem to some degree, but it never really quite caught on because ultimately engineers just want to live in the tools that they're using every day. They don't want to be installing other things or going off into third-party apps. So, that's where we kind of, I guess, cut our teeth in the XR space and really learned about the challenges and the problems and the reasons why it hadn't really kind of taken off in that domain. And this was around the time we were looking to be acquired by Siemens as well. So that was one of the products we came into Siemens with, as well as all the rendering stuff.
Yeah, and for context to the listener, the timeline we're talking about here is like 2013 to 2018, right? So this is, if you think about the eras of VR and the different hype cycles of it, this is actually like I got involved in VR kind of towards the tail end of your time in that role. When the MetaQuest 1 came out is when it became a no-brainer for me, right? And I think a lot of people, I think about this formula of value minus cost plus effort equals a buying decision. And so there's the cost of the headset, the cost of the software. When you think about enterprise use cases, that's honestly probably the smallest piece of the formula. I think if it's valuable enough, people will find the money and kind of set the budget aside for it. But the effort of the hardware stack and getting people to adopt the headsets and learn the controllers and the type of software that's available, how much is out of the box, how much do you have to customize and build uniquely for each use case, that all adds a lot of effort. And what that does is it limits your use cases to the most high value use cases. So to your point, like a really big, important design review with key stakeholders where you want to have the biggest impact possible or something along those lines. Or the whole DICE thing from Stanford of like highly dangerous, highly expensive scenarios.
Yeah.
What are some of the biggest changes you've seen from 2013 to now here in 2025, where you feel like either the amount of effort for XR adoption has gotten easier and the friction's been reduced, or the value has gotten stronger because of the type of software we have available or the use cases that we can adopt? How do you think that formula has changed over the last 10 or so years?
Yeah, it's a great question. Maybe I'll start on the hardware side. So when when we were first exploring this, we were, mainly looking at the Vive and the Vive Pro around that era. And I'm sure you've tried these devices, like they were phenomenally powerful and capable, but there was a relatively big effort in terms of the setup and usage of them. So by that I mean, if you wanted to go and demonstrate this to a customer, you'd have to take with you all of the stands, all of the trackers, power for all of that, adapters if you're going to a different territory with different power outlets. So it was, looking back, it was like a huge operation just to take this kit and set it up, and combined with that the best in class GPU performance at the time as well. Like, you were severely limited in terms of the amount of data polygons you could push, like the complexity of the model into these environments in VR. I think fast forwarding to today, some of those things have improved a lot. Most of the XR headsets on the market today are kind of inside out tracking, standalone. Some of them are still tethered for power. But you don't have to worry about any of those sensors anymore. So that's a huge, reduction in terms of effort for the end user. Obviously, the compute power has, continued to improve over the years. I would say when you're dealing with large CAD models, like if you take a big shipping container or something that's got 10 or 100,000 individual line items for every nut, bolt, panel, piece, pipe in there, to load that all into an XR environment in real time is still a challenge. Let's say. So we've still got some way to go on that side. But I think in terms of the use cases, because some of the effort is reduced, we are seeing a lot more adoption of XR across different parts of the manufacturing and design value chain. So, design review has always been a classic one, but we see some simulation use cases. We see some manufacturing planning use cases. We see, in operation use cases, training use cases. Like there's things popping up all over the place, and I think the challenge for an enterprise adopting some of this is still the maybe the kind of disconnected nature of some of these tools. Most enterprises will have tools from various different vendors. They've probably all got different UI, different setups. So now you're into a kind of effort perspective in terms of learning and using the tools as opposed to the setup. So it's still not perfect, and I think there's some way to go, but it's definitely grown a lot since the original days when we were looking at this maybe 7 or 8 years ago.
Yeah, that last point you mentioned is one that I see a lot of. I feel like the developer maturity has grown so much with the volume of developers building for 3D use cases, and then also applications that have existed for a long time, right? Like, we actually have people that have been building for the last 10, 20 years, and some really established software tools that have the enterprise level security and the functionality that you need. And that makes it a lot easier to jumpstart a program versus having to custom build every single piece of software from scratch. That's a world that makes it just much more difficult to justify which tools do we build versus which tools do we license. And then your point about the hardware as well, like it's gotten a little bit easier, but that last piece around like cultural adoption and change management and kind of navigating buy-in from stakeholders, like that's a piece that I think is really, really tricky. And so it's a topic I think that helps both XR vendors that are looking to kind of sell their product into a company, but it also helps the people within these big companies that are trying to adopt the tool or find a use case for it. If they're trying to get adoption, do you have any advice on how to navigate that process of kind of gathering buy-in or overcoming some of the cultural resistance to XR?
Um, I mean, I've got some experiences. I wouldn't say we've got a perfect answer yet. My personal opinion is that we're still very much at we're kind of day one, really, still for kind of enterprise adoption, at least in the domain I work in for engineering and design. I think there's some great enterprise use cases outside of that where the data is maybe a little bit more static and they can kind of control the experience a bit more. But certainly for us, we're crossing that kind of chasm now between Those first couple of enthusiasts within an R&D team or an IT team who were tasked with looking into these technologies, and now we are starting to bleed over into the more day-to-day design engineer type persona. And they've all got some awareness of what XR is. They've all tried it at some point in the last 7 or 8 years, and probably have decided it's not quite for them yet because of the reasons we've talked about, like it's too complex or too much effort to get into an experience that gives them value on a day-to-day basis. But we are starting to bleed over now, and the conversation for me, I've noticed, has moved on from what is VR versus what is AR versus what is XR versus what is MR, and it's less about the kind of wow factor of the technology, and you get right into the hard questions of like, okay, how easy is it to use? Where's the data coming from? Can it move back and forth? Can I make changes here? They want to know, can I do real stuff here, as opposed to like, oh my god, this is my first VR experience. So the conversation's definitely evolved, I would say, in the last 5 to 10 years. Well, it has definitely evolved in the last 5 to 10 years, and I think we're kind of crossing that chasm now into the space where it will become more ubiquitous, but we're still probably beyond the innovators now and getting into that kind of early adopter part of the curve.
Yeah, it's almost like when the personal computer started gaining traction. Like initially, it's like, what is this? Just a really complicated big calculator, and mostly used for like spreadsheets and things like that, or like what can it really be used for? And then you start to see all these new applications, and people don't need to understand what is a computer anymore. It's more like, what can I use it for, and can I justify the cost and effort to adopt it for my use cases? That's a very different conversation than just what is that technology, like what is that brick that I'm putting on my head. It's
Yeah,
like, no, I kind of get what a headset is, I kind of get the concept of 3D, but now, like, why does it matter for me
yeah.
personally? And that's a totally different type of conversation to have.
And coming back to
um
your original point about sales, I think something that's really carried forward in terms of a skill set for me personally is, the type of companies we interact with range from consumer electronic companies making smartphones, through to toy companies making little bricks to build stuff with, through to car companies, through to airplane companies. And all of those folks have very different use cases and needs. You get these kind of ubiquitous things like collaboration, which is great for anyone in any process doing anything. Everybody gets that. But you really have to show them how it can be used to do the things that they're doing in their business. And we're kind of going through that at the minute, where we've produced a load of like launch materials for the product we've been working on with Sony. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But now we're getting into okay, show me how I can do my specific workflow in my industry. So it kind of suddenly balloons in terms of the amount of content you've got to create to illustrate workflows and value for each of these industries. And that's kind of the next wave of stuff that we're thinking about right now.
I actually think it's a great segue into that piece of your story and what you're working with, because I think that when I saw the Sony launch at CES, 2 CESs ago now, I remember that's something that stood out to me a lot about the approach you've taken with the hardware is literally custom controllers, like with the Ring, and kind of shifting the approach to be more niche, to support a very specific type of use case, a very specific type of persona, that uses it for these things. Having hardware that enables that or that fits those use cases in a more specific way was a pretty interesting take on an XR device. And so I'm curious, from you're on the marketing side and understanding the type of consumer, understanding that persona. What was but actually, maybe before getting too deep into the weeds, maybe at a high level, you could talk through why you guys collaborated with Sony and kind of what that collaboration is, and then we can get more into the weeds on the persona research and kind of
Yeah,
why
sure.
why you made some of those decisions. Yeah.
Sure. So yeah, just to kind of put it in context, so Siemens as a company, the part of the company I work for, we sell industrial software for designing, manufacturing, and operating products, and that ranges everything from Red Bull Racing with Formula One race cars to cutting edge aeroplanes with companies like Nautilus, who are developing a blended wing body aircraft, and everything down to smartphones and toys. So our customers range across all these different industries, and Sony, who have been a customer for a number of years now, they flipped from using a competitor 3D CAD tool 7 or 8 years ago, I think. And at the time, when they kind of consolidated on the Siemens tool chain, they saw a 25% productivity increase just from moving to the kind of single supplier for all of those types of products. And their head of engineering, a gentleman called Amatatsu-san, is very close friends with the head of our division, a guy called Bob Halbrock. And the Sony team approached us and said, listen, we're really happy, but we're now looking for that kind of next wave of productivity. And we are really excited about the technologies that are available to us now in the XR space. We're thinking about making this new mixed reality headset and controllers specifically for designers and engineers. So it would be a very niche product, but very capable. And what we'd love to do is work with you guys to partner to make sure it's really well integrated into the tool chain that we use, and we know that a lot of other companies around the world use. Would you be interested? And of course, we said yes. So fast forward to CES last year. That was when we made the partnership announcement as part of the keynote at CES. And then this past 12 months, we've been doing a kind of big awareness piece around the partnership and around the solution, finally launching it on January 23rd this year. So it's been a roller coaster of a year, but it's been good fun.
It's so exciting, and congratulations on the launch. I know it's a challenging space to keep up with pace, and to your point, the data changes so much with things innovating every month. So I'm sure there's plenty of conversations over the last 12 months about how do we just fit in this one more thing or this one more idea. That's a lot to juggle. And this is interesting. So this idea stemmed from an internal use case. It's like we're seeing a big investment. We're seeing big productivity internally around these tools. So how do we take this to another level? And then we assume that we can then take that to market as well to other teams that are experiencing the same kind of things we are. I love that, because I think in the XR space, that's a big personal goal of mine, is like, how do we get more XR teams using XR? And so if the use case is coming from an internal need, it makes it a much more compelling story, I think, and makes it a little bit easier to gather buy-in, because it's like, no, we're legitimately seeing results from this. Like we're invested in this, and we think it'll help you too. So
I think
maybe
something that's interesting there as well is, as well as the fact that it's come from a customer who has the capability to do this. Like, there's not many companies in the world that can do this, but Sony as a company are fascinating. If you look at them, like, we all think immediately of things like the PlayStation or the Walkman or cameras. But when they talk about their capabilities in the context of this product that we've done here in the XR space, they really talk about things like, the optics and the lenses in the cameras, which they can repurpose and reuse in the headset. They talk about, the displays, things that they make for their TVs and their cameras. They talk about things like, tracking and control, which they have in a couple of other products like MoCopy. But also they've got a whole team that's been working on a Sony VR headset for many years now. So they've actually got an incredible mix of technologies, which they probably license to other companies already in this space, and the know-how to build a high-quality product. So it was a really interesting mix, and equally they saw us as a great partner to be able to access many companies in different industries who are making products in the real world, like phones and cars and planes and trains and all sorts.
Yeah, and obviously on the consumer side too, like the PSVR 2 is something I've heard very positive things about, like the eye tracking and some of the experiences that they've built more on the consumer kind of gaming side of the business. Is there any overlap between the people that work on something like the PSVR 2 either being involved in this project or collaborating with the team to kind of share learnings or anything like that?
Yeah, there's definitely overlap and learnings. I mean, they are two very different products and demographics and target audiences, and they've been designed with those personas in mind. But yeah, I mean, the fact that they've done this already, on a consumer level, definitely gave a lot of learning, I guess, and a big leg up to creating this stuff. They weren't going in completely cold.
And I'm sure that helps significantly, right? Being able to understand like the interface of how a person interacts with spatial design, like it's something I talk about a lot with spatial computing in general. Is I think that one of the biggest challenges over the last 10 years is it's a new design medium. So when you think about the transition from like live theater to television, movies didn't start as being these like cinematic bingeable content series that we have now. Like a lot of television was literally just theatrical acting and play style entertainment thrown on to one camera, looking at it from a wide angle, and commercials were even just panning over to like a guy at a table with a holding a product. It wasn't until later that we started layering in like maybe we add a second camera and cutting here from there, and maybe we can make this more cinematic, and kind of over time you start to develop these design principles where now a kid like me could grow up going to film school with an iPhone and being able to
Yeah.
create short stories and understanding the basics of what to do to make it look good. And I think that the XR space is going through a similar maturity stage where some basic things of like where do you put a menu, or how do you grab that menu and scale it, or how do you click on something, where do you place this control in a 3D environment. That's a new medium for us to kind of experiment with, and we've started to see some patterns now in some of those design principles. But I wonder from a software perspective, how you guys think about kind of experimenting with a new medium and trying to kind of make some of those decisions on like how to set up a software in a spatial environment versus a traditional kind of SaaS tool.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question actually, and this was a kind of deep philosophical point that we debated very at great lengths early on in the process. So, without going into too much detail, and NX, which is the CAD tool from Siemens, it's a 50-year-old product. So there's a lot of stuff in there. Menus, functions, features, things you can do. So philosophically, early on, we decided, well, we're not going to replicate every single button, menu option, and feature in an XR equivalent because we'd be there for the rest of our lives trying to do that. So we took the decision to provide some kind of basic things within the NX Designer environment. So the kind of things you'd imagine from a typical design review tool, like navigation, changing environments, section planing, markup, snapshots, all that kind of basic stuff. And that's been there for a little while now. And then what we've decided to do is, and I think this is a really underutilized part of most XR solutions, is these kind of virtual monitors. So you can have your virtual monitor open with your 3D CAD session, and you can still interact with it with a mouse and keyboard like you normally would if you're at your desktop, or you can use the controllers to point and click. And that means you can do anything within the application still. And any of those changes come through immediately in real time into the XR view. So any design changes you make to the model will come through into the XR view immediately. But you have the ability to have this kind of huge virtual monitor inside your virtual workspace. So that was our kind of baseline. We'll provide some basic tools plus the ability to do anything by interacting with your CAD session. And now what we're looking to do in conversations with customers is to really understand, okay, so what are these really high value workflows where we can build some specific UI to allow you to do something that either you can't do in a kind of traditional desktop environment, or we can help you do it way more efficiently or much quicker, or just make it a much nicer experience. So one of the examples that comes out time and time again is something like doing cable routing. So imagine you're in the belly of a big ship, and you need to, route a load of cables through different kind of parts of the boat. To do that in a, mouse and keyboard 2D environment at your desktop is possible, and it's great. People can do that, and they do that today. And you can have a kind of schematic view and a 3D view. But we've heard from a lot of people, if you could do that by walking around the ship and placing points and have these kind of cables appear within the XR space, and then you can kind of move all these control points around and, at human scale, see how those cables interact with structural parts of the ship. That just naturally feels like a way more intuitive experience. So we're kind of in listening mode for those kinds of workflows, and what we'll do in those situations, I imagine, is maybe build out some more custom UI within the XR environment to do those things more efficiently. And this is why we really think of it as day one for XR in our industry, because we think we've solved the problem quite nicely of getting data seamlessly into an XR environment without doing all the export and round tripping that we talked about before. So customers can get in there, they can do some things, they can get value out of it, they can work with their CAD tool in real time. And now we want to slowly start to expand out those really high value workflows.
Yeah, I think that being so there's one thing there that I love, which is like being thoughtful about the design of like how do we build off of the great work we've already done with 3D design on a 2D interface, and make choices about what pieces of that we pull into a 3D interface and how we do it. I think being really thoughtful about that is smart, and that's kind of the core to making sure it actually gets used. But the other thing, when you talk about that specific use case, like it sounds to me like that's coming from a deep understanding of the persona and the people who are going to actually use the combination of this hardware and software. What is that process like? How do you find the specific persona and do that research to understand them better?
Yeah, I guess this is an understanding of how our business works and how our customers work. So Siemens goes to market by industry vertical, by industry. So, we have whole teams of, marketing, sales, development, thinking about these kinds of problems for automotive, but also for aero and for heavy equipment and for consumer products and electronics and marine. Um, and I think one of the advantages a company like Siemens has because of its scale is we have that coverage of human beings, of people across both geographies and industries who engage every day with customers. Now, not every person in Siemens is trained on how to use this system. Obviously, you need a certain level of capability, but we are very intentionally skilling up targeted people within the sales force to have these conversations and be able to demonstrate to customers and understand what these use cases are. And they have a direct line into the marketing team and the product management team and the development team. So it's a real collaboration to understand what the needs are of the industries. And obviously, if there's a great use case that can span across multiple industries, that's a great sweet spot. But there will obviously be kind of very niche things that different industries need.
So it kind of starts internal first with, again, leaning into your strengths and advantages of having scale, having a base understanding of your customers already, to kind of collect like where do we start, and then you find those priority use cases where the folks internally that you can upskill to then have a more in-depth conversation or start to kind of do these high-level demonstrations and collect feedback that way.
Yeah, that's it. And as we've released the product now as of last month, those customers who are starting to adopt the technology are also feeding back. So we've got a real wealth of information coming back into the team who are creating the product and thinking about the future direction of the product to really help inform where those really high value use cases are moving forward.
So let's talk about what makes this piece of hardware so different than other pieces, because I think you guys have made some bold choices, right? Like the controller, it stands out so quickly, right? I think it, from a use case perspective, it seems very practical, and I'd love to hear more from you talk about that. But also from a branding perspective, because it is so different, like that, just having for those who haven't seen it, the way the controllers are designed is very different than say like a MetaQuest controller or the hand and eye tracking trends and some of those things. The controllers are designed very specifically, with a ring on one hand, and then the other controller is a little different as well. Maybe you could talk through the design choices on how you built those controllers and kind of why you made those decisions to make it so different.
Yeah, sure. And there's definitely kind of two pieces to this. There's obviously the hardware piece, which is where Sony's expertise really come in, and then there's how that works within the context of the software. So there's a couple of interesting stories in both. So on the controllers, because you mentioned those first, the team who developed these are all users of our CAD tool first and foremost. So they know what they wanted from these controllers, and they knew that they didn't want a more general purpose, MetaQuest type gaming controller. Those things are fantastic, and they have to cover a multitude of use cases. But we had a great advantage here where we could think about some very, as you say, niche specific workflows and use cases that we could be a bit more focused with. So for the Ring, one of the big design decisions there was that you could keep it on and wear it and still type and use your mouse, so you could interact with the primary input that people use today for their CAD workflow, which is a mouse and keyboard, or a keyboard and space mouse. So it was designed to be unobtrusive. You could still work with it even without taking it off. And as an input method, it's kind of got a capacitive touch pad on the top, so you can swipe and move, but also a couple of clicky buttons, so you can grab and select and move things. And it's really designed to be that the way that you kind of pick up an object. So you've probably seen some of the videos where people are kind of virtually holding an object and inspecting it while design changes are happening. That was the real kind of core day-to-day use case for it. Then the pointing controller, Sony actually did a really interesting talk specifically on this at our user event last year, where they talked about some of the design choices and how they led up to that. So the original design was going to be a pen. So that was the kind of basis of where they thought, and that was based on being very accurate with your selection. So selecting points and edges and being able to move these things very precisely. But what they found in their testing was that when you held out a pen and the pen would kind of dip as you clicked it, so you would lose the precision that you wanted when doing selection. So that was one of the issues they had. And then the second one was, well, you can drop a pen, and when you've got your headset on, how do you know which way around you're picking it up? Is it the active end or the inactive end? And then the third one was, to avoid you dropping it in the first place. So they came up with this kind of triangular design. So the hoop on the top is so in case you drop it, it just kind of rests on your finger. You can pick it up either way, so it's kind of doesn't matter which end of the pen you're picking, but ultimately you're holding it and using it very similar to how you would use a pen. So it's got like a selection surface on the top and a couple of other buttons. So the inspiration was a pen for precision, but they kind of iterated to get a more stable tool to use in XR. So yeah, you're right. Very interesting, bold decisions. And most people who we've taken this out and tried it with at events, and that's thousands at this point. Like any new piece of technology, there's a couple of minutes of trying it out and learning it, and it's a new input method. How do I do this? But after 2-3 minutes, most people are moving around and doing things pretty intuitively. It's quite impressive to see. And I think the other interesting anecdote is the how we utilize those tools within the software themselves. And I think the navigation's a really interesting one. I actually posted a video about this on LinkedIn a few weeks ago. So most people, when you're navigating in VR using a general purpose controller, you're probably either teleporting or dragging the world around you, or using some kind of joysticks to move around in VR. And we of course tried all of those schemes, and what we found for our use cases was that because a lot of the products range from very small, like a cell phone or a smartphone, up to a huge ship, we needed to think of multiple ways to navigate. So obviously in augmented reality, you just walk around and move the model around. That's easy. In VR, what we came up with, and this was a real deep collaboration between the Sony team and the Siemens developers, was a kind of like joystick mechanism, but in virtual. So you kind of hold your ring and you'd press the button as if you're holding a joystick, and you kind of tilt your hand forward and back, left and right, and that moves you forward and back, left and right. And then there's a way to kind of float up and down and rotate as well. So it's quite new, but once you get the hang of it, after a minute or two, you can zip around these models really quickly. It's quite cool, and I think there's actually a kind of joint patent going out for that one as well, because it's obviously the first time anybody's done this with these controllers. But some fascinating, UI challenges when you're working with entirely new hardware is, how's the user going to pick it up? How are they going to use it? How are they going to navigate? but great challenges for the team to work on, of course.
Yeah, I love the specificity of it because it's but both of those things make sense to me. It's like in your use case around manipulating objects and design, and it's a very specific, focused use case. And so being able to move around with the intent of looking at an object or being able to understand a 3D design, that's very specific. It's not as generic as just any sort of world traveling that you might need to do. But the one about the pen and the precision, that really stands out to me as well, because whenever I've talked to any of these kind of more product prototyping use cases or design use cases, that specificity is really important to be able
Yeah,
to kind of slightly move something just the exact amount you want to, or if there's 20, or well, let's say even more, like 200 components that are going to be connected together in a product, being able to click on exactly the one that you want and being able to not have to fumble around to pull up the data that you're looking for is very, very important.
and
You
that of
mentioned,
course involves, it's not just the controllers, it's the latency of the software and the connections between the controllers and the headset and the tracking and everything. Like it all has to sing in harmony to work, which is a real testament to both teams how they've managed to implement that.
yeah, it's interesting because it's one of the first use cases for me where I've seen such a well marketed kind of front and center of the industry device be tied so tightly to a software. So it makes it a lot more kind of interoperable, where that software and that hardware work together very seamlessly. That's not something I've seen quite as often in the space. I think typically it's these kind of two or three headsets that are kind of the mainstream headsets, and then a lot of developers building on top of them. And when you have that ability to deeply build and design the hardware and the software together to work seamlessly like that, I think it really opens up some very functional use cases. You mentioned something a second ago about events and watching people kind of experience the hardware in person and being able to kind of observe how people interact with it. And I think events are so interesting because there's kind of one camp that thinks that events are all about kind of lead generation and like how many deals can we get from our booth. And then there's also this other camp of brand awareness and education. And something that I've found from events that I think is really underrated is that when you're in person in a place where everyone's there to learn about it, you could have 100 conversations in an hour, and you hear the words in your pitch. Like we were talking about sales earlier, it's like you can feel the body language and you can change your pitch in real time, one conversation to the next. And after an hour, it's almost like you just got 6 months of demo time in. And like when you go back the next week to your regular process, I feel like there's so much learnings that you can take away from an event. I wonder from your perspective as a marketer, when you go to these events and trade shows, like what are your main goals? Like what are some of the metrics that you take into mind for success when you go to an event?
Yeah, so I think the first couple of events we started taking working prototype hardware software out to were kind of this time last year, and actually it was always a collaboration between myself, who was leading the marketing, product management, and the development team. We'd always go as a collective because we felt it was so important for everybody to have those first-hand, live, raw customer feedback experiences. It's always massively diluted, even if it's secondhand. If it's just me relaying stuff, I'm marketing, I understand the technology, but I'm never going to get all of the detail that the developers would need. But also the customers, or the more discerning folks in the industry like yourself, they can come up and ask some really pertinent questions that maybe an end user even wouldn't think of. And it's great to have the people who are writing the code and Sony, who are literally building the hardware, all of us together on the stand to be able to interact. Yeah, a huge amount of learning, and I think it really helped shape the final UI, the final interactions, even some kind of tweaks to the hardware over the course of last year. So it was a great learning curve to do that stuff out in public, but you've got to be able to do it in a very well considered way, because if you've got to have enough of a solution to go out and show something and talk about something. You can't just go out with videos and ideas. People will very quickly get bored. And it's at kind of what point in the development process do you do that? And you see different companies taking different approaches to this. Some people wait until it's finished and they whip the cover off and, hey, here it is, go buy it. Other people, literally are prototyping in public from day one. So we took a decision to go out at what we felt was a early enough but mature enough point to have a kind of stable solution that we could show to people. And again, it's great to go to a mix of events. We have obviously in Siemens, we have our kind of core industry events where different manufacturing industries come to, whether it's automotive or aerospace or industrial machinery, but also going to some of the the XR events. Like we've been to AWE last year, which was fascinating because we got to interact with the other hardware vendors, and you kind of assume that everybody's going to be guards up, defensive, protective of their space, wary of new entrants. But actually, it's the complete opposite. Everybody ultimately wants the industry to succeed, and actually having competition or people focusing on a certain niche just raises the boat. We made our announcement last year when the Apple Vision Pro came out, and there was all sorts of comparisons. How is it the same? How is it different? And actually, we just looked at it as well. Apple, whatever they do, they bring a phenomenal amount of attention to an industry. So it really kind of gave a shot in the arm this time last year to the whole XR space, which benefited everybody in the long run, I think.
Yeah, AWE it's such a fun event when you work in this space, especially for someone like you who's worked in it for so long. It almost feels like a big family reunion where you get to see all the people that are really experienced and been around this for a long time, and they've got all sorts of unique takes on things. I think there's a balance to it. Like, I think it's good to go to the events where it's less XR focused and like you're getting totally fresh perspectives and faces, and I think that's important too, to get out of the XR echo chamber. But going to AWE and CES and some of these events where you do get people that really know their stuff and have been around it, and you feel that welcoming energy, where even direct competitors sometimes are just excited for you and are like, wow, you did something really cool with that technology, and here's my 2 or 3 reactions to it. And everyone's just kind of trying to help each other. It's pretty exciting.
It's great. It's great. And it was very kind of heartwarming to hear that from some of our peers in the industry as well. It's great.
Yeah. So now that the launch is official and kind of rolled out, what are some of the things you're most excited for 2025? Kind of shifting gears from go to market and that initial design phase of putting it all together. What are you excited about for like the full rollout now that we're kind of in market?
Yeah. So I mean, I talk about this a lot with the development team, the product management team, that we've kind of been in this bubble for the last 3 years, all talking together on a kind of relatively small group chat and bouncing ideas off. And suddenly we've expanded the bubble of people within the business who are now taking that message out to customers. With the sales team and things like that. And in one way, that's quite scary, but actually it's incredibly exciting because now we're getting 10x more input back into the project as well. And I think as one of the biggest things we did last year was to go out and kind of source some early customer references where we could have customers obviously not say, we've been using this for 3 years and here's the results we've got, because that's not true. But they were able to say, we're excited about this technology because, and here's the kinds of use cases we can see. So what I'm excited for next is to have waves of customers who've actually bought the devices and can feed back and give some further kind of case studies and testimonials. And I think from a technology point of view in the industry, the thing that really excites me, and I was convinced of this at CES when I went to the Meta booth and I tried on the Meta Ray-Bans and interacted with some of their team over there. I think that sweet spot of interaction input for XR is going to be some kind of controllers tracking, but also the natural language interaction with the AI. That was really mind-blowing. And seeing, I think, some of the ways that Google are looking at doing this with Gemini and with the Samsung device, I think this is definitely the way our industry will move forward. And like any big technology company, of course, Siemens is deeply invested in AI and has been for a long time. And we're of course looking at similar kind of interaction methods moving forward. So I'm super excited for that as well.
Yeah, it's kind of like at the full circle, right? Like at the beginning of the conversation, you're talking about the Iron Man use case, and I've probably mentioned that one more than almost any other metaphor for this technology, because I think it's just relatable, right? Like so many people that are not into the XR industry yet have still seen that Iron Man scene, and like they know how powerful that is the second they see it. They just think it's a dream, and they think it's 30 years away, and they're not as close to the technology. But I think this is that intersection where getting the software and the hardware right, like we're pretty much at the cusp of that, and then merging the AI assistant piece of it to be able to bring it all together into one cohesive kind of platform. I think that is going to really change the game for all of these different spatial experiences.
Yeah, I do, and I think particularly in our space, like he's a designer, a tinkerer, an engineer, Tony Stark, and he's doing that thing, that workflow. We've got all of the pieces now. It's a case of bringing it together in a way that makes sense in the real world for different industries. So that is genuinely very exciting for me. Like that was the inspiration of why I kind of got hooked on the industry in the first place. So to see it finally become almost there within touching distance is super exciting. I can't wait.
I think too that the big impacts from it is one is it closes the skill gap where it takes someone a lot less effort to learn the interface if they have an AI assistant that can bridge the gap for them. Like at Arthur, we see this already in the collaboration space where if we want to create a pin board with notes on it and kind of share these ideas, if I can just say, Arthur, generate a pin board for me with these 3 ideas on it, and or hey, like we've been brainstorming for 30 minutes. Arthur, did we miss any ideas? Like, do you have any ideas for us that maybe we should consider before we wrap up with our conversation, and have it be able to fill some gaps or add those ideas to the board to make sure we don't miss something? I think there's this enablement function there that's really powerful. But the other thing is it kind of ties into something you talked about with the latency issue, where 5 years ago, there was too much latency between the data you're building for the 3D model versus getting it into the headset and getting to actually go experience it. I think AI solves a latency problem for other things where like, man, I'm just trying to remember where that part is or what that part does, or there's so many things I'm trying to remember as a designer in real time. If instead of having to click through 20 tabs and scroll through things and read back to where that was, or go back through a Microsoft Teams chat with my team or whatever and go find it, if I can just say, hey, AI, can you remind me what that part does real quick? Or can you remind me of what our marketing team had shared around this design or the feedback that I got? And it just pops up for you. That is so much more efficient than having to go through that process of take the headset off, go dig around, come back.
Yeah.
So I think that
Interesting.
latency
When
issue
you
is
brought
big.
up there, the selection within a kind of very complex, many thousands of piece CAD model, that was one of the first implementations of AI within NX, within the CAD system. So being able to select something and say, obviously it's not voice at the minute, but basically select similar or show me all the similar parts, and it just automatically does that because it understands your data in a safe environment. So it's instances like that, or when you talk about brainstorming before, let's say you're kind of designing a bike and you say, okay, we've got these 3 ideas that we've designed using these weight, strength, size parameters. Can you maybe just generate me 3 or 4 more that are similar but maybe optimized for weight or strength or whatever? And it's not doing the engineering for you. You still have to be a knowledgeable engineering practitioner to create these things and know what you're creating. But I think the AI can really augment what you're doing in those instances, and that's the bit that's super exciting. I don't think we're going to anytime soon be at a point where you say, "Hey, go and design me a new passenger jet, and stick it on the production line." Like nobody thinks that's going to be real anytime soon, but it can definitely augment and enhance the things that you're already doing, I think.
Totally. Or simulating scenarios, right? Like I was just talking to Jonathan Beals, who was a big piece of spearheading 3D design at Nike, and now he's doing solutions consulting at Adobe. And that was a big thing he talked about, is like one of the big value adds of 3D for design is if you can cut down the iteration cycles, where if instead of it taking a dozen iterations of building the physical product, if we could cut that down to 2 or 3, and we can get a product delivered in 2 months instead of 2 years, it's insane how much value that adds to a business, both in
Oh,
cost reduction, but also time to market and all these things. And I think AI has this ability to help you imagine what scenarios might happen or simulate that data as well. Like if I'm talking about a jet engine, well, what is it like under these weather conditions, or what are the potential weather conditions that might have an impact on this particular part failing or something like that, and being
I
able
think
to
it's always
do that faster or earlier in the cycle.
for sure, yeah, yeah. I think it's always quite a little bit disingenuous to say that XR or any kind of technology is going to completely eradicate physical modeling and prototyping. Like, there's so much learning you can get from that, and we're always cautious about making statements like that. But there's a great example I heard from the marine industry where if they want to explore a physical space, a space that they're going to build within like a boat, for instance, they will often build a full mock-up out of MDF or plywood. And these things are huge and take up a lot of space, take a lot of time. As we talked about previously, the design will have kept marching on since then, so they'll be out of date anyway. And normally they're building them to do things like check access panels for maintenance, for instance. Now that is a phenomenal use case for XR, because what they're really having to do is bring a trained maintenance person into the building, into this mock-up, to test whether they can get their tools or they can reach the things that they need to reach within the behind the access panel. That's a phenomenal use case for XR, because you can use the digital twin. You can do those things in XR in virtual reality. You can the maintenance engineer doesn't have to know how to use the CAD system. You put the headset on, they can walk around an environment they're familiar with, they can test access, and you can learn all of that in hours rather than weeks that it would take to build that prototype and get that person on site. So you're right, it's kind of condensing the time to get that information and the answers you need. And it's finding those high value instances where that's makes the most sense, I think, is the name of the game.
Yeah, just more iterations and more repetitions. Like I think you mentioned a learning use case much earlier on in the conversation too. And funny enough, I think this is specifically a Siemens reference where I was talking to Alan Smithson about different L&D use cases, and I think he
Okay.
worked with you guys a few years ago, where it's like a medical piece of equipment. And the thing is, you're not going to replace training on the physical machine. But if you can reduce physical training from 5 days to 1 day and have infinite reps on a digital version of the machine first,
Yeah.
that's still a massive cost savings, and it's much more efficient when you're training at scale. Maybe you're training a couple thousand people on how to use this device. It's way more effective if you can get them to only need a day with the device to get to the same level of proficiency than a full week.
Well, it's a game changer. Like all the travel costs as well of getting those people to the location to come and work on that medical device or on that boat prototype. Like, you're not going to send that around the world to 1,000 people. They've got to
No,
come to you.
yeah, you can't send that out to 1,000 people. There's no way. And if you did one at a time, that would be so
Yeah, you do that
expensive
forever.
and take so long. This is amazing. I think it's a really interesting category that you're working with, and it's a really innovative piece of technology. I do want to be respectful of your time. I know we're coming up on our hour here. Is there any other topics you want to touch on real quick, or anything you want to plug about the work that you're doing, or how people can find you?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, if you search for Siemens or Sony Immersive Engineering, you'll find our websites. In terms of trying these things out, there's a few ways we can do that. We'll be at a number of events throughout the year, obviously mainly to address our niches. But if you do want access to a demonstration, we have a number of trained people in various territories that can do this. So I'm sure we can find a way. But yeah, come check us out.
And definitely follow Ben on LinkedIn. Don't spam him with sales messages, but his content's great, and he consistently shares some really good videos for specific use cases and things they're doing with the device. So definitely check it out. Otherwise, that is the pod.